A little girl suffering from a bone disease was abandoned on the street on a freezing, snowy night by her stepmother. Just as the child was losing consciousness due to the brutal winter storm, a luxury vehicle unexpectedly pulled to a stop. When the door opened, a wealthy gentleman immediately rushed to the little girl and did the following. Chicago's notorious "The Hawk" wind shrieked through the gaps between the skyscrapers, lashing against passers-by like frigid whips. The rickety wheelchair, the last remaining possession after the suburban home was foreclosed, had its wheels caught in a mound of gray, slushy snow right at the entrance to Millennium Park. "Oh heavens, this blasted thing," Madeline muttered under her breath, her designer leather gloves gripping the handles of the chair. She kicked the wheel with the toe of her high-heeled boot, attempting to push it forward. Clad in a blazing red mink coat, a lavish gift from her late husband that she refused to part with even after being financially depleted, Madeline looked like a spark of fury against the white backdrop of the snow. Sitting in the chair, Sophie was huddled inward. The 6-year-old, her bald head swimming inside an oversized wool hat, tried to make herself as small as possible. "I'm sorry, Aunt Madeline. I can get down and push it myself," Sophie whispered, her breath puffing out in a thin stream of vapor. "You stay put," Madeline snapped. But then, noticing a few tourists glancing their way, she instantly lowered her voice, switching to a saccharine, unnerving tone. "What I mean is, your little legs are too fragile, Sophie dear. The doctor said your bones are delicate as glass. Now remember, I just can't risk you needing any more procedures. Your daddy's life assurance fund, well, it's completely run dry." The comment stung Sophie's fragile self-esteem like a needle. Ever since her father passed in a traffic mishap 6 months ago, Sophie had constantly heard Madeline discussing money. Money for medicine, money for the house, money for food. The child lowered her gaze, looking at her thin, shaking hands, remembering the days when her father was alive. He used to lift her onto his shoulders so she could touch the twinkling garland lights on the Christmas tree. Now he was gone, leaving her with a beautiful stepmother who always looked at her with the calculating eyes of a losing stockbroker. They stopped in front of the Bean, the Cloudgate sculpture. The gigantic stainless steel surface reflected the thousands of sparkling lights from Michigan Avenue, but it also distorted the images of the woman and the child. One was glamorous, the other frail and worn. Madeline crouched down, facing Sophie. She reached out and adjusted the child's scarf, covering the skinny neck and the dark bruises left by infusion needles. The gesture appeared nurturing, but Sophie felt only the coldness of the diamond-studded fingers. "Listen, sweetie." Madeline sighed, her voice suggesting a heartfelt confiding between two friends. "We can't stay in Chicago any longer. I just spoke to your grandma in Ohio. She agreed to take us in. But the bus tickets are so pricey, I only have enough cash if we leave tonight. Go to Grandma's." A glimmer of hope sparked in Sophie's eyes. "But shouldn't we pack our suitcases?" Madeline froze for a second, her gaze darting away quickly before returning to Sophie, her smile brighter but utterly vacant. "Those clothes are old and shabby. No need to lug them along. Once we get there, I'll buy you lovely new dresses. Right now I have to hustle over to the Greyhound station across the way to stand in line for discount tickets. You know how it is, Christmas Eve. Everyone's trying to get home. The crowds will be enormous." With that, Madeline reached into her pocket and pulled out an empty matchbox, something she had impulsively picked up from the hotel bar earlier that day. She slipped it into Sophie's hand, pressing the little fingers to hold it tightly. "Hold on to this. This is your placeholder ticket. If you have this, they'll know I have my child with me. But can't I come with you? It's so big here." Sophie pleaded, her voice beginning to tremble with fear. Madeline made an impatient clicking sound with her tongue. "Please don't make this difficult, Sophie. Look at the snow pushing the chair across the street. Right now is too dangerous. Do you want me to get hit by a car like your father?" Sophie shook her head violently, tears threatening to spill. That was her absolute weakness. Her deepest fear was the disappearance of a loved one. "Then be a good girl. Madeline gently stroked Sophie's wool hat, her voice a hypnotizing whisper. Just sit right here. Exactly here. Don't roll the chair anywhere. If I come back and you're gone, I'll assume you wandered off and I'll have to get on the bus all by myself. You don't want to be left alone with the boogeyman, do you? I promise. I'll sit still as a statue. Sophie hugged the matchbox to her chest. That's my girl. Madeline stood up abruptly. She offered no parting kiss, nor did she look back at Sophie even once. She turned her back and walked decisively toward the chaotic crowd. Her slender figure in the bright red coat stood out against the swirling white snow, her pace quickening as if she were fleeing a scene of wrongdoing. Sophie sat motionless. The wind chilled her face to the bone, but she dared not lift a hand to shield herself, afraid of dropping the placeholder matchbox. She fixed her gaze on the red back, waiting for Madeline to turn and wave as she always did. But she didn't. The red coat grew smaller, merged with the bustling flow of people, and then vanished completely around the street corner. Around Sophie, cheerful laughter and Christmas music played, but for her, the world had suddenly collapsed into a terrifying silence. The snow began to fall harder, dusting the fragile shoulders of the 6-year-old who was utterly alone in a city of millions, her innocent trust slowly fracturing with every passing second. The clock on the Wrigley building in the distance had just struck 10 o'clock. 2 hours had passed since the red coat of Madeline disappeared, and Sophie still sat there motionless as a tiny ice sculpture in the heart of Chicago. Her exposed hands were numb with cold, yet her fingers remained curled, clutching the empty matchbox. It was the only remaining link, the ticket ensuring she hadn't been abandoned. The discomfort from her illness began to surge. Initially, it was a dull ache in her knees. Now, it spread like 1,000 stinging pins along her spine. It's okay. I'm not hurting. Sophie mumbled, her teeth chattering. She tightly closed her eyes, trying to imagine she was lying on the old bed at home, covered by her dad's thick mint-scented wool blanket. If she cried, the tears would freeze on her cheeks and Madeline would scold her for being a nuisance. The stream of people thinned, but was still dotted with late-night tourists. A young couple strolled by, laughing and taking selfies with the bean. The man accidentally bumped Sophie's wheelchair armrest. "Oops, sorry, kid," he said quickly without bothering to look down, then pulled his girlfriend toward the lit Starbucks on the corner. They probably thought she was waiting for her parents to grab a coffee. Sophie wanted to call out to them to beg for a little warmth from the steaming coffee cup, but her throat was dry and frozen. She was afraid that if she spoke, Madeline would suddenly reappear and punish her for bothering others. The shivering gave way to a strange sensation. Sophie's eyelids felt heavy, and the biting cold seemed to vanish, replaced by a pleasant warmth spreading through her skin. She opened her eyes, but the snow-covered plaza was gone. In the hazy vision of her delirium, Sophie saw herself sitting in front of the fireplace in the old living room. Her father was there in the worn leather armchair, holding the storybook, The Velveteen Rabbit. The fire crackled in the hearth, releasing the comforting scent of pine wood. "Daddy." Sophie smiled, a weak expression on her chapped lips. "Read me the part where the stuffed rabbit turns real." She lifted her numb hand into the air, making the motion of striking an imaginary match, just like in the story her grandmother used to tell. A bright spark flashed in her mind. Her father turned, smiled gently, and waved her closer. The warmth from the fireplace felt so real, so vivid, that Sophie wanted to jump out of her wheelchair and run into his arms. "Little one, are you all right?" The illusion vanished. Standing before Sophie was a middle-aged woman walking a golden retriever. The dog was sniffing at Sophie's soaked canvas shoe, its tail wagging softly. The woman frowned, her phone screen still lit with an ongoing call, looking at Sophie with a mix of pity and haste. Sophie blinked, trying to shake off the haze. She looked at the woman, then at the warm, golden-furred dog. A faint survival instinct kicked in. "Ma'am," Sophie's voice was a feeble whisper like a kitten's meow. "Can you tell my mother? She went to buy the tickets. It's taking too long." But the howling wind through the high rises swallowed the fragmented sounds. The woman seemed not to hear clearly, Or perhaps she was too engrossed in her phone call. "I bet your parents are in the public restroom over there, aren't they?" She answered herself, then tugged on the leash, pulling the dog away when it tried to lick Sophie's hand. "Let's go, Buster. It's late. We need to get home and roast the turkey." The woman's silhouette disappeared behind the curtain of falling snow. Sophie watched her go, disappointment settling heavily in her chest. She looked across the street where the awning of a department store glowed with warm yellow light. If she could roll the chair over there, she would be less cold. Just 10 wheel turns. Sophie placed her hands on the wheelchair rim, but immediately Madeline's instruction echoed in her mind like a steel command. "If you move, I won't be able to find you." She withdrew her hands. The fear of being abandoned was greater than the fear of perishing from the cold. She would rather freeze right here to prove she was a good girl than be warm for a moment, only to lose her mother forever. "I'm still here. I'm being good," Sophie whispered to the void. Her head felt heavy, slowly slumping to her chest. Her awareness drifted into a white, peaceful void, a place without pain or cold where only her father waited with open arms. Sophie's fingers gradually loosened. The empty matchbox, the treasured promise keeper, slipped from her grip, falling onto the soft snow with a muffled thud resting beside the wheel. Precisely at that moment, the dense black night was sliced by two glaring beams of light. A sleek black luxury vehicle slowly pulled to the curb, its headlights sweeping across the scene, shining directly onto the small, collapsed figure in the lonely wheelchair. The winter tires of the Maybach S650 gently crunched over the snow-covered pavement, creating a quiet, smooth sound. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and subtly scented, with expensive leather completely isolated from the blizzard raging outside the double-paned windows. William Grace rubbed his temples, folded his tablet, and tossed it onto the seat beside him. At 45, he controlled the Grace Hotel empire, stretching from New York to London. But on this Christmas Eve, he was just an exhausted, middle-aged man, escaping meaningless social engagements. Thomas turned the music off. "I need quiet." The chauffeur glanced in the rearview mirror, quickly lowering the volume of the mournful, silent night. "Yes, sir. We're almost past the park area. The road to the estate should be clear." William didn't reply. He gazed absently out the window. Chicago rushed by like a blurred black and white film. His eyes drifted aimlessly until they snagged on a strange shape at the roadside, right beneath a pale street lamp. A wheelchair, and something small, motionless, slumped over like a forgotten doll. William's heart skipped a beat. A gut feeling, the sharp intuition that had helped him find multi-billion-dollar business opportunities, yet the same one that always tormented him when he thought of his sister who vanished 10 years prior, suddenly rang a loud alarm. "Stop the car." Thomas hesitated, lightly tapping the brake, but not stopping completely. "Sir, that's probably just debris from a festival, or maybe a mannequin thrown out by a store. No one would be out in this area at this hour." "I said stop the car." Immediately, William's shout ripped through the silence. Thomas jolted and slammed the brake pedal. The car skidded a short distance on the snow before coming to a complete halt. Without waiting for the driver to open the door, William shoved the heavy door open and rushed out. He ran toward the wheelchair, his breath clouding in hurried white puffs. The closer he got, the crueler the truth became. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a child. William dropped to his knees in the snow, his hands trembling as he touched Sophie's thin coat. "Little one, hey kid," silence. William removed his gloves and pressed his warm palm against the child's cheek. Ice cold. The coldness of stone of life slowly ebbing away from the body. He frantically shook her shoulder gently. The tiny hands hung limp blue and chapped from the intense cold. Sensing the sudden warmth, Sophie stirred slightly. Her snow-heavy eyelids slowly fluttered open. In her delirium, the image of the tall man before her blurred, mixing with the memory of her late father. She didn't see William's expensive suit or his horrified expression. She only saw a pair of arms opening to embrace her. Sophie's lips moved slightly, her voice as weak as a sigh of wind. "Daddy." Are you here for me? I was a good girl. I stayed put. I didn't go anywhere." William froze. The innocent words struck his chest like an iceberg digging deep into the never-healing wound of his own loss. He looked into Sophie's deep, watery eyes and saw a heartbreaking absolute trust. This child had sat here waiting until she passed out just to keep a promise. A surge of anger, hot and fierce, ignited within William. Who could be cruel enough to discard such a tiny angel in this frozen purgatory? "Yes, it's me. I've come to get you." William choked out, his voice cracking. He couldn't bear to shatter the little girl's final illusion. He quickly stripped off his thick cashmere overcoat, wrapping it tightly around Sophie, cocooning her in warmth. He slid his hands beneath her legs and back, lifting her into his arms. Oh my goodness, she was too light. The little girl was as weightless as a broken-winged fledgling. William could feel her fragile ribs clearly through her thin clothing. It wasn't just the cold. This child was severely depleted. William held Sophie, tightly shielding her from the howling wind, then sprinted back toward the car. Thomas opened the door, blast the heater to the highest setting. The driver, now realizing the severity of the situation, quickly opened the rear door. William carefully laid Sophie down on the spacious leather seat, then climbed in himself, supporting her head on his lap. "Where to, sir? The public hospital or—" "To Grace Medical Center. Call Dr. Robert immediately. Tell him to prepare the special trauma room. Tell him I'm bringing in a child fading away from hypothermia. Hurry!" The Maybach roared to life, speeding into the night, leaving the abandoned wheelchair and the empty matchbox buried in the snow. Inside the car, the warmth from the heating system began to circulate. William gently rubbed Sophie's tiny hands, trying to instill some life back into her. "Hold on, little one. Don't go to sleep. Do you hear me? Stay awake." But the sudden temperature change triggered a paradoxical reaction. Sophie's body suddenly cramped. She began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, then convulsing in spasms. Her breathing became strained and ragged, like someone drowning, desperately trying to gasp for air. Her eyes rolled back hauntingly. "No, don't you dare!" William was genuinely panicked. The composure of a business mogul completely vanished. He gripped Sophie's shoulders, trying to keep her from hurting herself during the seizure, his eyes fixed on her rapidly changing face. "Thomas, drive faster. She's going into shock. Run the lights, I will take full responsibility." William yelled, his hands trembling as he stroked Sophie's forehead, cold sweat breaking out on his own. For the first time in 10 years, William Grace felt the dread of loss so tangibly present at his fingertips. He bent down close to the child's face, whispering desperately, "Please, don't give up. I will help you." The Maybach S650 sped up the emergency bay ramp of the Grace Medical Center, skidding to a sharp halt that left a faint burning rubber scent on the cold concrete. The car door flew open before the wheels had fully stopped. William rushed out, carrying Sophie's limp body in his arms. "Robert, I need Robert down here now." William's roar echoed through the lobby, overpowering the hospital intercom announcements. The on-duty nurses were momentarily stunned, realizing the frantic man was the corporation's chairman, the hospital's primary benefactor. A gurney was swiftly brought forward. Quick medical commands were barked out. William gently placed Sophie on the white mattress, his hand lingering for a second on her shoulder, before the tide of white coat separated them. Unstable heart rate, level 3 hypothermia. Prepare the defibrillator. The trauma room door slammed shut, locking William outside with the flashing red light of the operating sign. For the first time in his life, standing in the sterile hallway smelling of antiseptic. William Grace realized his powerful black cards or calls that decided the fate of entire companies meant absolutely nothing right now. He was just a helpless man, trembling not from the cold, but because a tiny life had just slipped through his grasp. An hour dragged by like a century. William slumped on the waiting bench, the black coffee in his hand, long since cold. He didn't dare drink it, afraid that even a small movement would trigger bad news. The door clicked open. Doctor. Robert, chief medical officer and William's college friend, stepped out. He removed his surgical mask, revealing a face etched with weary lines and a dark look William had never seen on his usually composed friend. William sprang to his feet, knocking the coffee cup onto the polished floor. How is she? Is she stable? Robert didn't answer immediately. He gestured for William to follow him into his private office, closing the door and drawing the blinds completely. He poured a glass of water, drained it in one gulp, and then looked directly into his friend's eyes. We managed to save her life. Her body temperature is stable. William exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping with relief. Thank heavens. That's good. No will. It's not good at all. Robert's voice was firm, and his suppressed anger began to leak through every word. He slammed the freshly printed patient file onto the oak desk. Do you know what you just brought in? William frowned, stepping closer to pick up the file. What do you mean she has bone cancer? I know. I saw her head was shaved. The bone cancer is the least of her issues. Robert interrupted, his voice shaking with indignation. The x-rays and blood work paint a much more devastating picture. Her stomach is empty, Will. Completely empty. The only things we found were gastric acid, a little water, and some stale breadcrumbs. She hasn't had a proper meal in at least 3 days. William was stunned. 3 days, but she was dressed decently. That's a damn glamorous facade. Robert slammed his hand down on the table. But that's not the worst part. Look at this index, toxicology drug screen. William looked at the highlighted line, morphine oxycodone negative. Negative meaning she hasn't been using pain medication. That's a good thing, isn't it? William was confused. Robert chuckled bitterly, taking off his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. You don't understand medicine, Will. For a late-stage bone cancer patient like her, the tumor is eroding her marrow from the inside out. The discomfort, it's like having thousands of glass shards cutting into your bones every single second. Adults need high doses of morphine just to fall asleep. But her blood is clean, not a drop of pain medication. William was speechless. The image of Sophie huddled in her wheelchair, biting her lip, not daring to utter a sound, rushed vividly back to him. You mean, she's been cut off from her treatment for a very long time. Robert looked straight into William's eyes, confirming every word. This isn't just typical abandonment. This is deliberate torment. Someone allowed her to endure that astronomical agony consciously and starved her. Her back is covered in sores from lying in one place without proper hygiene. Silence descended upon the room. William's initial pity slowly transformed into something else, cold and sharp. It was the fury of a predator. William pulled out his phone and dialed an emergency number. David, listen. I'm at Grace Hospital. I need you to mobilize the entire cybersecurity team and my private investigators. Get me the identity of the guardian of the child I just brought in. I want everything: name, address, bank transaction history, security, camera footage. I want to know who did this before sunrise. Immediately hanging up, William turned to Robert. I need to see her. The VIP recovery room was so quiet that the steady beep of the monitor was clearly audible. Sophie lay small beneath the layers of pristine white blankets, IV lines taped to her thin arm. Sophie's eyes fluttered slightly and then opened. Her dazed, bewildered gaze swept across the unfamiliar ceiling. When she saw William standing by the bedside, her reaction was not joy, but terror. She recoiled, trying to shrink into a corner of the bed, though her motionless legs wouldn't allow it. Sir, her voice was hoarse, fractured. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. William rushed to her, lowering his voice to the gentlest level possible. No, Sophie. You did nothing wrong. You're at the hospital. I'm William. You're safe now. But Sophie seemed not to hear the reassurance. She looked down at the crisp white sheet, then at the clean patient gown she was wearing, and tears began to well up. I've soiled the boss's bed. I didn't mean to. Please don't scold me. Sophie, look at me, William said sorrowfully, reaching out to take her little hand. But Sophie flinched away as if burned. Her eyes darted around the room frantically. "Where is my mother, sir?" "She told me to wait on the bench next to the bean. She said she was getting bus tickets. If she comes back and I'm gone, she'll really leave me. Sir, please take me back to that spot." The heart rate monitor began to accelerate rapidly. "Your mother, she's not coming back," Sophie William forced himself to say the truth, knowing how cruel it sounded. "I found you after the snow had completely covered you." She left. "No," Sophie screamed a high-pitched, heartbreaking cry. She shook her head violently, the tears pouring down. She promised. She said she'd only be 10 minutes. Maybe I fell asleep. Maybe I was naughty. I'm a burden. "Sir, let me go. I have to go back there. She's waiting for me." She struggled, trying to slide off the bed, disregarding the tubes pulling taut against the tape on her veins. Her subconscious mind told her that all suffering was her fault, that being rescued was a terrible mistake that would make her mother angry. William had to grip her shoulders firmly, his heart aching as he felt the small body convulsing with terror. "Calm down, Sophie, I'm here. No one is going to hurt you." Just as the struggle between compassion and psychological trauma peaked, the room door flew open. David Williams' stern-faced chief of staff, who looked like a former FBI agent, strode in. He said nothing, his face set like stone. He walked straight to William's side, holding out a glowing tablet. "Sir, I have the identity of the woman, and you need to see this." William let go of Sophie so the nurse could administer a mild sedative. He took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. It was an Instagram post uploaded 30 minutes earlier. The picture showed a beautiful young woman with bright red lipstick checking into the indoor hot tub at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, just a few miles from where Sophie lay freezing. She smiled radiantly, the smile of someone who had just shed a heavy burden. The caption was brief, but enough to boil William's blood. "Freedom at last. Goodbye, dark past. Tonight is all mine." William looked at the smile in the photo, then turned to the child who was sinking into a forced sleep, tears still damp on her cheeks. His knuckles were white as he clenched the tablet, feeling as if the screen might shatter under the pressure of his fury. He looked up at David, his voice low, sounding like a death sentence. "Prepare the car and wake up my best team of lawyers. Tonight I want to teach her the price of her freedom." The presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton Chicago was warm with the scent of lavender essential oils and the smooth sound of jazz music. In the large marble bathtub full of white foam, Madeline leaned back, closing her eyes to savor the feeling of a true lady of leisure. She had ordered a chilled bottle of Dom Perignon and a plate of chocolate-dipped strawberries from room service. "Finally," Madeline whispered, reaching for the latest model phone on the stone ledge. She opened Instagram, swiping her thumb constantly to check notifications. The picture of her holding the champagne flute had already hit 300 likes in just half an hour. Comments praising her glamorous beauty and dream life popped up continuously, stroking Madeline's craving for admiration. "That's right, keep being envious. I deserve this after 2 years of putting up with that sick child." She took a sip of the champagne, savoring the sweet tang on her tongue. Everything was perfect. Her flight ticket to Paris, scheduled for the following morning, was safely in her digital wallet. In just a few hours, she would disappear from cold Chicago forever, leaving behind piles of medical bills and the bothersome stepdaughter she was certain had by now turned into a lifeless block of ice in the park. Madeline reached for the remote, switching on the enormous flat-screen TV on the wall to check the weather forecast for Paris. But instead of images of a sunny Eiffel Tower, her eyes were slammed with the bright red words, "Breaking News," scrolling across the local news channel, WGN9. A Christmas Eve miracle has just taken place in downtown Chicago. Hotel billionaire William Grace reportedly stopped his vehicle to rescue a little girl abandoned in critical condition. Madeline's arm holding the champagne glass froze mid-air. On the screen, the camera zoomed in on the scene of the incident. Although the image was slightly shaky and blurred by the falling snow, Madeline immediately recognized the rickety old wheelchair abandoned by the roadside. Worse yet, The reporter held up to the camera a tattered gray wool scarf, the very one she had wrapped around Sophie just hours earlier. Crash! The crystal glass fell onto the marble floor, shattering into pieces. Expensive champagne spilled out, mixing with splashing bathwater. No, it can't be. Madeline sprang out of the tub, oblivious to the soap suds running down her body. She rushed to the TV screen, staring wide-eyed. According to sources close to Grace Medical Center, Mr. William Grace personally rushed the girl to the emergency room and is currently remaining at the hospital. Representatives for the Grace Corporation have announced they will mobilize all resources to locate the relatives or the individual responsible for the abandonment. Madeline's heart pounded violently against her ribs. A cold dread shot down her spine. Police, jail time, cold iron bars. She envisioned herself being handcuffed right at O'Hare Airport. I have to leave now. I have to leave right now. Madeline frantically grabbed a towel, intending to rush to pack her bags, but then a name mentioned in the news bulletin made her stop in her tracks. William Grace. She turned back, staring intently at the face of the man on the screen. William Grace, the real estate magnate whose fortune was estimated in the billions, a man she only dared to dream of seeing in Forbes magazine. And he was holding Sophie. The fear in Madeline's eyes slowly faded, replaced by another gleam sharper and more dangerous: greed. She didn't see a child who had narrowly escaped death. She saw a winning lottery ticket just salvaged from the trash. Wait a minute. If I run, I'll be a wanted criminal. But if I go back, Madeline muttered, her brain working at full throttle. U.S. law always favors the custody rights of parents. She was the only legal guardian. Sophie was alive, which meant no murder charges. It was just a misunderstanding. And William Grace, a single, ridiculously rich billionaire, was showing concern for the child. What will he do? He'll want to keep the child, or he'll be afraid of media complications. A slight smirk slowly spread across Madeline's beautiful face. She grabbed her phone and dialed the airline. Hello, I need to cancel my flight to Paris tomorrow morning. Cancel it immediately. I have an unexpected family emergency. A refund. No, don't bother, just keep the money. Hanging up, Madeline stood before the large bathroom mirror. She looked at her reflection, sophisticated, sharp smelling of money. No, this doesn't look like a distraught mother. Madeline began a chilling process of transformation. She turned on the faucet, washing off the heavy makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes. She used some dark powder to contour her cheeks, making herself look haggard. Her professionally styled hair was ruthlessly brushed into a disheveled mess, as if she had just weathered a severe storm. She opened her suitcase and pulled out an old, worn tracksuit she had planned to discard, replacing her silk dress. In just 15 minutes, the socialite Madeline vanished, replaced by a distraught, panicked, and pitiful woman. Perfect. Madeline complimented herself in the mirror, then grabbed her phone and dialed an unfamiliar number, the hotline for the Chicago Sun-Times, a sensational news column which she had saved long ago. Hello, is this the newsroom? I want to report a huge story. Madeline sobbed, her voice trembling and broken. There's been an attempted abduction at Grace Hospital. My daughter, she's being held against her will by a billionaire. He's using his power to kidnap my child. Please come help me. She hung up, wiping away the fabricated crocodile tears. Now was the time for the final act. Madeline grabbed her bag, rushed out of the suite, and hailed a taxi straight to Grace Medical Center. She didn't use the back entrance. She told the driver to stop right at the main entrance, where the flashing lights of the reporters who had just received the anonymous tip were already starting to flicker. Madeline took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Immediately she began to wail, charging into the crowd of microphones and cameras. Get out of the way! Let me in! My daughter is in there! Give me back my child! Chaos erupted in the hospital lobby. Security guards tried to restrain her, but Madeline, with the power of a theatrical master, cried and shoved, creating a scene of perfect tragedy for tomorrow's front page. Meanwhile, in the soundproof recovery room on the 5th floor, the space was unusually quiet and warm. William sat on the edge of the bed holding a steaming bowl of cream of mushroom chicken soup. He gently blew on each spoonful patiently as if caring for the most delicate porcelain in the world. Sophie leaned back against the pillows, her eyes still swollen from crying, but her breathing was steadier thanks to the mild sedative. She looked at the soup, her stomach rumbling with hunger, but she didn't dare reach out. "Here you go, Sophie." William smiled, a rare, gentle expression his staff had never seen. "You don't have to feed yourself. Open up. Just one little bite. I promise it's delicious." "Mister," Sophie hesitated, her voice tiny. "After I eat, are you going to send me away?" William felt his heart clench. He shook his head firmly. "Never. Until you are completely well, you will stay here with me. No one is sending you away. That's my order." Sophie looked deep into William's eyes, searching for some falsehood, but she only saw a sincerity as warm as the firelight in her earlier hallucination. She timidly opened her mouth. William brought the spoon to her lips, the moment the soup touched Sophie's lips, marking the first moment of trust between two strangers. Crash. The room door rattled violently as if about to break off its hinges. Shouting and chaotic noise from the hallway burst in, shattering the peaceful atmosphere. And then, a shrill, familiar voice, so recognizable that the blood in Sophie's veins turned to ice, echoed through the thick oak door up in the door. "William Grace, you are a kidnapper. Give me back my daughter." Sophie jumped. Her eyes widened in horror. Her small, trembling hand reached out, accidentally knocking William's arm sharply. The fragments of porcelain shattered on the floor, foreshadowing the collapse of the brief moment of peace. The room door was flung open so hard that the doorknob hit the wall, creating a shock wave that rattled the air in the room. William's two large bodyguards were shoved aside. Madeline charged in. She no longer possessed the sophisticated look of the Ritz-Carlton lady. Her messy hair, pale face drenched in tears, and disheveled clothes made her look exactly like a mother who had endured hell on earth to find her child. Right on her heels were the blinding flashes of tabloid photographers who never missed an opportunity to hunt for sensational news about the ultra-rich. Before William could step to block her path, Madeline lunged straight for the bedside. She collapsed onto the floor, her two hands grasping Sophie, who was shrinking with fear. "Oh my God, Sophie. My precious little girl." Madeline wailed, her voice cracking with sobs, a perfect performance for every lens pointed at them. She squeezed Sophie tightly, but it wasn't the embrace of comfort. Sophie stiffened. The heavy scent of perfume mixed with old wine and Madeline's sweat flooded her senses, triggering every nerve of fear. Mommy was only gone for 10 minutes to buy bus tickets. "Sophie, why did you run off? Why did you do this to me? Do you know how panicked I was when I came back and saw the empty wheelchair?" Madeline cried while shaking Sophie hard, making the child's head wobble. To the public, this looked like the hysterics of an overly anxious mother. But William, standing right beside them, saw the coldness in the woman's eyes. He stepped forward, reaching out to gently detach Madeline's hands from the child. "You're hurting her. Let go." The moment William attempted to intervene, Madeline suddenly lunged forward fiercely, hugging Sophie's head, pressing the child's face into her chest, obstructing William's view and the cameras. She leaned close to the child's ear, her voice instantly changing tone. No longer a sobbing cry, but a sharp whisper hissed through clenched teeth, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "You're a clever girl, Sophie, daring to tattle on Mommy to a stranger. You've disappointed me so much. You want to put me in prison, don't you?" Sophie trembled violently in Madeline's arms. "No, I don't," Sophie whimpered, tears streaming out. "Be quiet." Madeline squeezed harder, making it difficult for Sophie to breathe. "Listen carefully. If you don't tell this man to release you immediately, I'm leaving. I'll abandon you here alone forever. Be smart and admit it was your fault. Say you wandered off, now." The fear of abandonment. The ultimate weapon Madeline had honed over the past 2 years pierced the most vulnerable spot in Sophie's soul. In the 6-year-old's innocent mind, William was kind, but he was a stranger. She would rather endure pain and familiarity than be thrown into the abyss of utter loneliness. Madeline, released Sophie, took a step back and faced William and the reporters with tear-filled eyes, waiting for her praise performance. William saw the change in Sophie's eyes. The light of trust that had just flickered to life had been extinguished, replaced by the grayness of desperate submission. He stepped closer, trying to salvage the situation. "Sophie, don't be afraid. Just tell the truth. Tell everyone how she left you in the park." "Don't come near me," Sophie screamed, her voice cracking. She recoiled toward the head of the bed, pushing away William's reaching hand. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand, to leave her alone so she could be safe in her own way. "Mister, please go," Sophie stammered, tears running down her chin. "It was my fault. I was naughty. I rolled the chair myself. Mom didn't abandon me. She loves me. I'm sorry, Mom. Please don't leave me." The air in the room froze. William stood paralyzed. His arm was still extended in the air, lonely and redundant. Sophie's innocent lie was like a slap of cold water across his face, washing away all the protective efforts he had just built. He saw the triumph creeping into Madeline's artificially twisted mouth. The reporters began to murmur. Camera lenses pointed straight at William, recording the image of a powerful billionaire being rejected by a sick child. In the eyes of the public at that moment, he was no longer a hero, but an abuser of power, separating a sacred mother-daughter bond. "Do you hear that, Mr. Grace?" Madeline stood up straight. She wiped her tears, her voice becoming sharp, filled with the self-righteousness of a mother defending her child against a dark force. She pointed a trembling finger at William's face. "She's afraid of you. She is begging you to let her go. I am her mother, her only legal guardian. I have all the proper documents. On what grounds are you keeping my child here, based on your wealth?" William clenched his fists, trying to maintain composure in the face of such blatant provocation. He knew he was losing this psychological game. "You know exactly what you did," Madeline. William said, his voice low. "The child is severely debilitated. Empty stomach, no pain medication in her system." "How do you explain that she's sick?" Madeline yelled, overpowering his accusation. "She has bone cancer. She suffers from lack of appetite. Do you think caring for a child with cancer is easy? You're a billionaire. You only know how to throw money around. How could you understand the suffering of a single mother struggling for every penny to buy her child medicine? I will sue you. I will sue this hospital for unlawful confinement and slander." She turned to the reporters, playing the victim role perfectly. "You are my witnesses. He wants to kidnap my child. I must take my daughter home now. It's not safe here." Saying this, Madeline rushed to the personal cabinet near the bedside. She snatched Sophie's old torn coat and aggressively tossed it onto the bed. "Let's go, Sophie. Mommy and you are going home. I won't let anyone hurt you again." Madeline acted roughly, without any gentleness, toward a patient who had just recovered. She slid her hands under Sophie's arms, intending to yank the girl off the bed, ignoring the tangled wires of the medical equipment still attached to the child. "Mommy, it hurts," Sophie groaned, but dared not resist, trying to drag her aching leg along with Madeline's pull. William stood there, his chest heaving fiercely. Logic told him he had no right to intervene. The law was on Madeline's side. If he used physical force now, tomorrow he would be on the front page for assault and child abduction. His company stock would plummet, his family's honor would be tarnished. But then his eyes locked onto Sophie's arm. Madeline, in her haste to escape, had grabbed Sophie's wrist and sharply tugged. The jerk caused the IV needle on Sophie's hand to shift. A line of crimson liquid oozed out, seeping through the white tape and staining the bedsheet. Sophie bit her lip to stifle a scream, but her face turned pale with pain. The last thread of reason in William's mind snapped. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the lawyers. He didn't care about the billion-dollar empire he carried on his shoulders. He only saw the blood of the child he had vowed to protect spilling out because of the villain's hand. William took a long stride. His tall body blocked Madeline's path, completely shielding Sophie behind his back. His large hand reached out not to grab Madeline's hand, but to simply block her line of sight, forcing her to release Sophie and step back. "Take your filthy hands off this child." The air in the room felt utterly sucked out. The reporters fell silent, lowering their cameras before the sheer intensity radiating from the man before them. William's voice wasn't a shout. It was low, resonating like thunder, signaling the greatest storm was approaching, carrying a supreme authority that brooked no argument. He looked straight into Madeline's eyes, his gaze a scorching fire that consumed the fake composure on her face. "Take one more step, touch her one more time, and I swear to God, I will show you what true hell on earth looks like right here in this city." The tension in the recovery room was at the breaking point when the crackle of a radio cut through William's murderous gaze. Two officers in the dark blue uniform of the Chicago PD walked in, followed by a severe-looking middle-aged woman wearing an ID badge from Child Protective Services, CPS. Everyone stand back. Now the commanding officer ordered his hand resting casually on his hip. William's two bodyguards were forced to retreat against the wall. William himself remained rooted to the spot, his broad back protecting Sophie, but he understood that the power of money was now hitting the steel wall of the law. Madeline seized the opportunity with the swiftness of a cobra. She pulled her hands back, her aggressive demeanor vanishing instantly, replaced by the trembling vulnerability of a frail woman under threat. "Officer, thank heavens you're here," Madeline sobbed, pointing at William. "This man, he's holding my daughter captive. He threatened to ruin me if I dared to take her home. Look at the child, how panicked she is. The woman from CPS." Ms. Gable stepped forward, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose, looking at William with a scrutinizing, rule-bound gaze. "Mr. Grace, I know who you are and your influence in this city. But this is a custody matter. You have no jurisdiction here. Please step aside so I can consult with the guardian." William took a deep breath, trying to suppress the raging anger in his chest to maintain necessary clarity. He turned to Ms. Gable, his voice low but firm. Ms. Gable looked closely at this child. She was in the park in a blizzard. Her stomach was empty. She had no medication. "If you let her take the child, that is a death sentence." Ms. Gable glanced at the medical file, then looked at Madeline. Madeline quickly produced a carefully plastic-sleeved set of documents. "I have all the proof here," Madame Madeline sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "She suffers from psychological anorexia due to chemotherapy side effects. I tried to force-feed her, but she threw it all up. As for the park incident, the child rolled her chair away while I was buying tickets. I am her mother. I suffer more than anyone when I see my child like this." Ms. Gable examined the documents, nodding with apparent satisfaction at the legitimate red stamps. She turned back to William, her tone becoming rigid and bureaucratic. "Mr. Grace, Ms. Madeline's paperwork is entirely valid. Regarding the abuse claims, I see no record of soft tissue injury or fractures from external force. Malnutrition is a common symptom in late-stage cancer patients. Unless you have direct proof right now that she intentionally abandoned the child under Illinois law, the child must be returned to the guardian." "I'm extracting the security camera footage," William ground out. "Just give me another hour. We do not operate on will-be evidence, sir. Currently, you are obstructing a legal guardian." William was choked. He looked at Sophie. She was huddled on the bed, her wide eyes watching the adults argue. When William's gaze met hers, Sophie quickly lowered her head, clutching the edge of the blanket. The fear of Madeline had completely paralyzed her will to resist. She didn't dare look up, didn't dare confirm William's words, because she knew if Mommy won, the punishment for a tattletale would be terrifying. Taking advantage of the police recording the report and Ms. Gable turning away to make a verification call, Madeline approached William. She stood close to him, pretending to adjust his slightly skewed jacket collar, a seemingly conciliatory gesture to outsiders. But when the distance was only a few inches, Madeline leaned up. Her heavy perfume hit William's nose. Her voice dropped to the lowest register, devoid of any sobs, only cold, raw calculation. "You enjoy playing the hero, don't you?" William looked down, meeting her sharp gaze. $5 million, Madeline whispered, quick and precise like a stock transaction. "Transfer it now to my secret Swiss account. I'll sign away my custody rights and vanish from the U.S. tonight. The child will be yours." William tightened his fists. His fingernails dug into his palms painfully. He wanted to shout the woman's true face to the whole room, but he knew no one would believe an unsubstantiated whisper. "And if I don't?" William asked back, his voice trembling with restraint. Madeline smirked a cruel half-smile. "If you don't, I'll take her back. And I promise you I will care for her so thoroughly that she will regret you saved her life tonight. Did you think I'd let you steal her for nothing?" She stepped back, patted his shoulder lightly, then turned to the police officer, raising her voice. "Officer, I want to take my daughter home now. It's too stifling in here. It's bad for her health." The officer nodded, stepping in front of William, his hand resting on his holster. "Mr. Grace, I need you to leave this room within 5 minutes so the family can complete the discharge procedure. If you continue to obstruct, I will be forced to take you into custody for disturbing the public peace." William looked around the room. Ms. Gable was nodding in agreement. The reporters outside the glass door were eagerly anticipating a scandal. And Sophie. Sophie still sat there, trembling and silent, accepting her fate to be dragged back to hell. A feeling of powerlessness welled up in William's throat, bitter and sharp. He had money, he had power, but he couldn't beat the cold loopholes of legal procedure. If he was arrested now, he would lose all future opportunity to access Sophie. "All right," William said, his voice husky. He raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'll leave." Madeline smiled victoriously. She snapped her fingers to the on-duty nurse, cowering in the corner. "You there? What are you waiting for?" "Change my daughter's clothes quickly. Use the outfit I brought." William retreated slowly toward the door. His eyes never left Sophie. He hoped she would look up, give him a sign or a reason to risk breaking the law. But Sophie kept her head bowed, her small shoulders shaking in silent despair. The desperation in the child's silence broke William's heart. The nurse quickly approached, pulling back the blanket roughly. She was abrasive because she feared Madeline's reprimand, swiftly unbuttoning Sophie's oversized patient gown. "Lift your arms, little one," the nurse urged. Sophie obediently complied like a mindless doll. The patient gown slipped from her frail shoulders. William had already placed his hand on the doorknob, preparing to turn and walk out of the room, accepting the most painful defeat of his life. A small, sharp sound echoed as a metal object fell onto the tiled floor, breaking the suffocating silence of the room. William paused instinctively. He turned his head and looked down. Slipped from inside Sophie's gown, rolling beneath the bedside, was an old necklace. The pendant reflected the neon lights of the ceiling, flashing a strange sapphire blue gleam that hit William's eyes directly. It wasn't child's play jewelry. William narrowed his eyes, and then his entire world seemed to stop spinning. His breath caught in his throat. That shape, that blue color. He let go of the doorknob, turned around, his eyes fixed on the small, silent object on the floor, right next to Madeline's high-heeled shoe. Before the police officer could react, William roughly pushed aside the arm blocking his way. He rushed to the bedside with a speed that startled Madeline, making her stumble backward, nearly tripping over a chair. William paid no attention to her, nor to Ms. Gable's scrutinizing gaze. His entire world now narrowed to the deep blue object lying on the white-tiled floor. William knelt, picking up the necklace. His hand, usually steady when signing billion-dollar contracts, now shook violently. It was half of a jade pendant, shaped like a phoenix wing, exquisitely carved with jade veins, whose every detail he had known by heart for 30 years. He reached into the inner pocket of his vest, close to his left chest, and pulled out a small, worn velvet pouch. "What in the world are you doing?" Madeline hissed, struggling to conceal the panic rising in her throat. "Give my daughter her property back." William didn't reply. He dumped the contents of the velvet pouch into his palm. Another piece of jade, also half a phoenix wing, rested neatly beside the piece he had just picked up. He slowly pieced them together. No gap. The fractured edges of the two jade pieces aligned perfectly like two halves of a soul finding each other after a decade of being lost. The entire room fell into absolute silence. Ms. Gable adjusted her glasses, stepping closer, her eyes glued to the undeniable evidence in William's hand. Just then, the room door flew open. David rushed in, sweat pouring from his forehead, holding a sealed envelope stamped with the red seal of the genetic testing lab. He said nothing, only breathing heavily and shoving the paper into William's hand. William tore open the envelope. His eyes quickly scanned the dry technical jargon and stopped at the bolded final number at the bottom of the page. Degree of kinship compatibility, 99.9%. Presumed relationship uncle, niece. William closed his eyes, a single hot tear rolling down his firm cheek. A sense of relief and overwhelming sorrow hit him at once, squeezing his heart. This child wasn't a stranger. This child was the flesh and blood of Emily, his missing sister. He opened his eyes, looking at Sophie. Now he understood why from the very first moment in the park he had felt such a profound familiarity. Those wide eyes, the way she pressed her lips together when afraid all were reflections of Emily. "You're not a stranger," William whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're my niece. You're home now." William stood tall, turning to face Madeline. The helplessness and repressed anger from before had vanished, replaced by the commanding aura of a powerful beast protecting its own kin. He held up the genetic test result and the two jade pieces for everyone to see. Ms. Gable officers looked closely. This woman claimed to be the only relative she lied. William took slow, deliberate steps toward Madeline, forcing her to retreat toward the window. "You are not this child's mother. You are a greedy imposter who hijacked my niece's life. This is Sophie Grace, my flesh and blood niece and the legal heir of the Grace family." Sophie sat on the bed, her wide eyes staring blankly at the jade piece in William's hand. A faint but warm memory surfaced in her mind. Her birth mother used to wear it, and she always said the other half was with someone who loved her very much. She reached out her thin hand, timidly touching William's coat sleeve. "Mister," Sophie asked, her voice trembling with hope, "you have a phoenix wing just like my mother. You know my mother. You're the person she talked about. You're her big brother, right?" Sophie's innocent question hammered the final nail into the coffin of Madeline's lies. William turned back firmly, clasping Sophie's tiny hand, nodding decisively. "Yes, Sophie. I'm Uncle William. I've been looking for your mother and you for 10 years. Madeline's face was ashen. She looked at the test result, then at William's murderous gaze, and finally at the police officer's look of suspicion. Her perfect extortion plan had collapsed before her eyes. She realized she had poked a hornet's nest with no way out. A mistake. There must be a mistake. Madeline stammered, backing toward the door, her eyes darting around for an escape route. I need to call my lawyer. You people are setting me up." But William gave her no chance. He signaled to David. "Don't go anywhere just yet, Madeline. You wanted evidence of how you cared for the child, right? I will show everyone right now." David connected the tablet to the large TV screen mounted on the wall of the room. The screen flickered to life, displaying the logo of a security camera extraction software. William looked at Madeline, his cold smile making her shiver. "Let me show you your own face on the big screen, shall we? Let's see if you can still deny it." The large TV screen on the wall illuminated, dispelling the dim shadows in the corner of the room. David tapped a few keys on the tablet, and a series of numbers danced across the view. It was the detailed bank statement with money transfer lines highlighted in bright red. William stood to the side, letting the truth speak for itself. He pointed to the recent transactions. "Ms. Gable, officer, look at where my brother-in-law's life insurance money went. Hermes handbags a vacation in the Maldives, high-end spa treatments. Meanwhile, the expenditure line for Sophie's medicine and chemotherapy is a big zero for the past 6 months." Madeline lunged toward the screen, her arms flailing wildly as if to cover the incriminating evidence. "Fakes, you faked the documents. Those were living expenses. I had to maintain a proper life to care for her. And what about this William cut off her clumsy defense?" The video from a security camera across from Millennium Park appeared. The angle clearly captured Madeline pushing the wheelchair, whispering something, then turning her back and walking straight into a nearby bar, leaving the child shivering in the snow. The air in the room grew thick. The unspoken outrage was evident on the faces of the witnesses. The chief officer stepped forward, blocking Madeline's line of sight with Sophie. "That's enough, ma'am." Ms. Gable from CPS approached, snatching the custody file from Madeline's hand with unconcealed disgust. "With this evidence, Child Protective Services is immediately revoking your guardianship. You are unfit to be a mother, even on paper." Before Madeline could react, 2 police officers moved in swiftly. There were no lengthy recitation of rights, just the cold efficiency of administrative procedure. The cold metal handcuffs clicked shut on her wrists, ending her glamorous charade. "You are under arrest for misappropriation of funds and intentional abandonment of a person unable to care for themselves. You're coming downtown with us." As she was being led away, Madeline's facade completely shattered. She struggled, her messy hair clinging to her makeup-streaked face. In her desperation, she turned back to Sophie, clinging to a last hope. "Sophie, say something, save Mommy. I raised you for all these years. Tell them to let me go, darling." Sophie sat on the bed, her small shoulders shaking. She looked at the screaming woman, then at William standing firmly beside her. A choice was made in silence. Sophie didn't cry, nor did she answer. She turned away, burying her face into William's suit coat, her small hand clutching her uncle's thumb. Her silence was the heaviest verdict, a complete rejection of that woman's existence in her life. The door to the room closed, shutting out the noise and deceit. The reporters also dispersed, leaving the quiet space they had found. William sighed, kneeling on one knee beside the bed to bring his eyes level with Sophie's. He gently unwrapped the small, tense fingers. From his pocket, he took out a tiny gold key, placing it neatly in her palm. Sophie looked up at him with her large, watery eyes. William smiled, a warm expression that dispelled the cold of the Chicago night. "It's over, Sophie. The nightmare is done. This is the key to your new bedroom. Shall we go home now, 1 year later?" The soothing strains of classic Frank Sinatra, "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," filled the large living room of the Grace estate. Gone was the pervasive smell of antiseptic and the cold white of the hospital. The air was now fragrant with fresh pine cinnamon from scented candles and the cozy warmth emanating from the marble fireplace. William stood on the mahogany ladder, holding a glittering gold star, carefully placing it atop the 10-foot-tall Christmas tree. He wasn't wearing his usual stiff black suit. Today, the powerful Chicago billionaire looked approachable in a cream-colored turtleneck sweater and comfortable khakis. The deep furrows of hardship on his forehead seemed to have been smoothed by peace, replaced by a gentle smile around his eyes. "Uncle Will, look what I found." A clear, ringing voice called out from the staircase, making William pause and turn around. Sophie was descending the steps. Gone was the old wheelchair and the thin, sickly appearance. Before William stood a little angel brimming with vitality. Her dark hair, once lost to chemotherapy, now reached her shoulders, soft and tied with a pretty red velvet bow. Her cheeks were round and rosy, reflecting the firelight. She walked slowly. Although her gait was still a little uneven, a lasting legacy of her bone disease, each step on the plush rug radiated stability and confidence. These were the steps of a warrior who had defeated the odds. William smiled, his eyes following her with undisguised pride, as if he were looking at the greatest achievement of his life. "Sweetheart, take it easy so you don't trip," he gently reminded her. Sophie walked straight to the fireplace. In her hand was not a toy or a sweet, but a small, worn object, the empty matchbox. She had kept it for a year hidden under her pillow. Previously, it was a symbol of a false promise of the fear of being abandoned in the freezing snow. But today, Sophie held it with a different intent. She stood silently watching the fire crackle. The warmth on her face was comforting and safe. Sophie took a deep breath, her small hand gently squeezing the box one last time. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered, then swung her arm and tossed the box into the center of the hearth. The flame flared slightly, licking up the dark cardboard. In just a few seconds, the matchbox, the physical embodiment of last winter's nightmare, dissolved into ashes. Sophie sighed with relief, as if she had just lifted a 1,000-pound stone from her small chest. She had officially shed the past, no longer the lonely match girl. "What did you just do?" William stepped down from the ladder, approaching her. "I just cleared away some old memories," Uncle Sophie beamed. She reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out another item. It was the 2 pieces of the Phoenix Wing jade pendant. From a year ago, now seamlessly rejoined by the finest jeweler William could find, using solid gold. The fractured lines were not concealed, but outlined in prominent gold, turning the trauma into an artistic symbol of sacred repair in Tsugi. "Can you help me hang this up, please?" In the very highest spot, Sophie offered the piece to William. William took the keepsake, carefully hanging it on a branch of the tree right beneath the gold star. The twinkling LED lights shone on the jade, making it sparkle, brilliantly illuminating that corner of the room. The Grace family, shattered for 10 years, was now whole. Sophie gazed at it for a moment, then suddenly turned, rushing into William's arms and hugging his waist tightly. She buried her face in his sweater, inhaling the familiar scent, a mix of cedar wood and the absolute safety only this man could provide. William bent down, wrapping his arms around his niece, gently stroking her soft hair. "Sophie," he asked softly, "I noticed you didn't write a letter to Santa this year. Is there nothing you wish for, a new Lego set or a doll?" Sophie looked up. Her large eyes were bright, reflecting the warm light of the room and the boundless love. "I don't need to write any more, Uncle," William asked, surprised. Sophie smiled, the most radiant smile William had ever seen, because Santa already read my old letter. "He sent you to me. You are my greatest gift, and I am yours. We have each other now. I don't need anything else." William's aging heart melted. A single tear of happiness silently traced its way down his cheek, but he didn't bother to wipe it away. He knelt on one knee, hugging Sophie tightly, whispering into her milk-scented hair, "That's right. You are my greatest gift, my little girl." The camera slowly pulled back, capturing the entire scene of the uncle and niece embracing beside the dazzling Christmas tree. Outside the large glass window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the Chicago sky in white, but the cold was permanently stopped outside the door. Because inside this home, amid the flickering firelight and the warmth of family, an eternal spring had truly returned. And that concludes our bedtime story for today. What a truly heartwarming story of lost resilience and a miracle discovered in the coldest of nights. The journey of little Sophie and William Grace reminds us that true family is not defined by papers or biology, but by the love and protection we offer each other when it matters most. It teaches us a powerful, enduring lesson. Even when facing the deepest darkness and cruelty, there is always hope waiting around the corner, often brought to us by the most unexpected angels. We sincerely thank you for staying with us through this touching story. We hope it leaves you with a renewed sense of faith in the power of compassion and the undeniable bond of family. Did this story touch your heart? What are your thoughts on William's immediate decision to protect Sophie? Let us know in the comments below. Until our next tale, we wish you a night filled with peace, warmth, and dreams of the beautiful spring that follows every winter storm. Good night, everyone.